Hi, it's Frendo here, and this is the second video I'm recording tonight. I wanted to talk a little bit about the determinism debate, because this has been interesting to follow, and I have to admit it's actually made me stop and had to think. I have had to really work through the issues that have been brought up. So to the determinists that I have talked to, thank you. And I know a lot of my friends and a lot of people I'm subscribed to and who are subscribed to me fall in the determinist camp. So I'm going to appreciate any input you guys have on this video. And for a couple of you, I've been exchanging comments with you on your videos. I do think it is interesting, and it has actually made me think about some things. But specifically, one of the points that I wanted to address is the functional MRI experiment, because this has been brought up by more than one determinist as not just fairly strong evidence, but as critical evidence that looking at the functional MRI experiment means that the entire concept of free will has to be thrown out, has to be chucked in the garbage. And so I want to address it now that I've read up on it a bit, because honestly I wasn't aware of the experiment before. I was aware, obviously, of brain imaging and some of the experiments that have been done concerning looking at brain patterns and what they mean, but not this particular experiment. So I'll link it below so people can read up on it. The problem that I have with saying it is a definitive end-all, chuck the concept of free will into the garbage argument comes in a couple of different ways. This was presented to me originally with the statement, if I put you in a functional MRI and give you any set of choices you can make, I'll know what you're going to say 6 seconds before you do. And that's not what this experiment has demonstrated. First off, the success rate is 60%. You can predict by 60%. Now, the reliability goes up when you use a different kind of method. The electrodes hooked directly into somebody's brain, then it goes up to 80%. But still, you're left with a fairly large margin of error to account for. What accounts for that margin of error? If you don't have 100% predictability, then there is some level that a person's brain is able to cognitively depart from this deterministic model that you are arguing for. Now, perhaps as techniques become more refined, as neuroscience develops, that will become 100%. But right now, we're not there. There's an awful lot for us to account for. Also, the time frame has a large degree of difference. 700 milliseconds up to 6 seconds. That is a large difference. And what accounts for it? Can we profile different types of people? Is there some significance if, say, you fall into the 2 to 6 second range, if you fall into the 1 second range, or if you fall into the 700 millisecond range? Will people who generally test for high impulse control, where are they going to fall? Are they going to be in the 6 second group? People with low impulse control are going to fall into the small category. Well, that would seem to be the case. We would predict that. But is that actually what occurs? And if so, what does that mean? Would you say that someone having low impulse control and someone having high impulse control is absolutely irrelevant to the issue of whether or not they exercise free will? We can determine their actions without looking at impulse control as a factor. Because it would seem to me to be that it's not. There have been enough experiments to show that one of the ways you can predict whether people will be successful in life or not is whether they have high or low impulse control, particularly at a young age. So how can you argue both deterministic positions, saying that impulse control would be critical in terms of predicting someone's success in life, but is completely non-existent relative to this experiment. And that brings me to another issue, or another limitation that I see with the functional MRI experiment. That being, you aren't giving people a choice that bears any consequences. So you really aren't testing whether or not they are thinking. So the brain has a null hypothesis. That is, any information that comes into the brain is automatically assumed to be true. Even if it's information that you would say you know is false, your brain will immediately assume that it is true, and then begin the refutation process, searching through your memory, firing up neurons to see whether or not this contradicts information that is extant. If the refutation process has not been engaged, then your brain would have no reason to disregard whatever its initial impulse is. So someone who has low impulse control and someone who has high impulse control would reasonably test exactly the same in this experiment. They don't have to engage with whatever initial impulse is generated by the brain, so there's nothing to deviate their thought process. Now, perhaps it would still be the same, but I contend if we aren't engaging in the refutation process, then we aren't really looking at thought. This wouldn't, in a neurological sense, constitute a choice. So it really doesn't bring us anywhere near the concept of free will. Now, it's been stated, I've seen in several comment threads, just a complete disregard for the concept of complexity and emergent properties. And I want to bring that up as a defense, because I do think that it is part of the issue. Yes, when you have increasingly complex systems, interesting, novel, and unpredictable emergent properties can be seen. So you can't predict rogue waves in the ocean, but you can predict that there won't be any rogue waves in a lake. Properties of that much water, with its energetic content in the ocean, you will see different behavior than the water that you have in a smaller, less energetic system. Life itself is an unpredictable, novel development. You can say it proceeds along deterministic lines. I mean, that's fine. Evolution is a deterministic process, but you can't predict where it will go. No organism knows what it is evolving into, why it is evolving structures. But that doesn't mean that the organism doesn't just use whatever it has. In fact, that's one of the things that drives evolution, is that organisms will use whatever body structures that they have relative to the situations that they are in. And that's something that you can't predict deterministically, that you have this one body structure that, you know, came into being under this set of pressures, but when the sets of pressures change, that body structure now has to be used for something else in order for the organism to survive. That's novel. Now you can talk about that being deterministic, and that's fine. But in that sense, I don't see free will and determinism as being necessarily opposed. I don't see that presenting some degree of determinism somehow means that free will has to be chucked into the garbage. Free will as a philosophical construct means you have the ability to choose relative to your frame of reference. So it is not to say, for example, that if I were to ask the question, can you fly? I say, well, yes, I want to fly. The fact that I can't just take off, that gravity is not a placebo effect, I can't say I therefore have no free will, I have no ability to fly because I am being imposed upon by gravity. Although I would still have to say there does have to be extant to my environment some means, some process for me to fly. But I am still deciding, I am still engaging in some thought process to come up with the idea that I want to fly. Now, you can still look at the brain and say everything that occurs is determined, because you have to have a brain to have thoughts, right? But have you never been conflicted about something that you are in the position of wanting to do two mutually exclusive things, or more, 3, 4, or 5 mutually exclusive things all at once? Have you ever been in a position of just sitting around, ending up not doing anything because you can't decide on a course of action? There have been mornings I get up and I sit hungry because I can't decide, do I want to cook something that I have on hand? Do I want to go get fast food? Do I want to go down to the store to buy something? Do I want to call up a friend and see if they want to get something? That stasis. Can you say that all of that is the brain conflicting with itself, and also say that that precludes the concept of free choice, of free will? Now, I'm not particularly married to the term free will. Maybe that's a bad term. It does have some religious connotation that goes along with it. But what I am interested in is the concepts of responsibility and the ability to change. When we look back at human history, we see things have changed. They have progressed from one state of being to another. Life now, today, is not what it was in the past. Even in terms of my own life, I can look back at forks in the road and see that I made a decision that put me on a different path. Could you have predicted, at age 7 that I'd be a teacher in South Korea? Well, relative to right now, it's an important thing. 5 years from now, it may not be. If I leave the country, I go into some other profession. But relatively, again, using an instance from my own life, could you say it, now that I am a civilian, it's not important that I was in the military? Well, no, I think from a deterministic position, you would say that all of the experiences that you have affect the probability of determined outcomes in the future. Hence, the actions that you take based on your own deliberation, whether that cognitive process is based purely on brain impulse or whether it involves some mode of conscious thought, is important. It does still determine the probabilities that you will be able to express in the future. And I have to also bring up the issue of this the supernatural fallacy that, yeah, many of us who are engaging in this debate, we are atheists and we are materialists. And it's not shocking to me to be told everything, every thought that you have, every process of your mind occurs in your brain. Right, I don't think that there's anything driving free will other than brain processes. Hence, I think that the two are compatible. Now, perhaps that makes me a compatibilist. Perhaps that makes me a determinist of some kind. That in order to be a materialist, you also have to be a determinist somehow. But because I have a moral philosophical construct that focuses on the importance of personal responsibility, of looking back at choices and seeing your life as something that you construct through your actions. Therefore, if determinism doesn't have anything to offer me in terms of those moral considerations, then I'm not going to call myself a determinist. So those are my thoughts on the issue. As I have experienced it so far, as I've seen it so far, and I can be subject to change, perhaps. I mean, changing terminology is not that big of a deal, but perhaps I'm wrong. So all comments and responses welcome. Thank you very much.